sort of climbed down within the Labour Party as being utterly scandalous, that they've moved from this agenda of pro-Brexit, and now they're completely, actually arguing to get rid of the referendum results, or hold a general election, or whatever day of the week it is that they're deciding something new.
So we're in an abyss with you. Pavlos, you come from the other side of Europe.
Yeah.
So give us, stick to this, the UK, but from you, Greece has been through a bit of stuff with Europe and the EU, hasn't it? So what structures do you see coming out of this Brexit thing that are new, and the whole Britain leaving?
So first of all, because you mentioned two or three things which led. Oh, sorry. Yes. So first of all, because you mentioned a couple of things that they didn't end up in the same situation. So yes, Greece was in an economic downturn, a severe economic downturn, and yes, we suffered in our everyday lives. I mean, just to be able to stand back on our feet. And we stand back on our feet with great sacrifices of our way of living. So I agree that the way the matter was handled to begin with could have been dealt better, but overall, I think we were protected by the European Foundation. We were not exposed by the European Foundation. So, and now we talk about something different, which is Brexit. And I'm in favor of what you said, that it's not worth discussing what happened, which I'm appalled, to be fair, of how an internal party issue became a country issue, because in my opinion this is what happened, you know, with under the Cameron government. And then the number of inconsistencies, lies, misaccuracies, and everything else that you mentioned about terms that most of the people don't even understand what they mean. They develop a meaning based on wrong information, and they develop an opinion based on that meaning. So I would say that, and that led to that 3 years of mess. And
can I just jump you on a bit there, because this is, we know this and we all have our feeling about this. But Austin made a point, and the point was that there have been ripples of this ever since we went into the European Union, and that the Leave camp was offered a vote. It took it and then hasn't been executed. So those ripples are not going to go away whatever happens.
Yeah.
And then Greece, I presume there are also ripples about whether it was the European Union's fault or not fault. In Hungary there are other things going on. So what are the future European structures that can be catalysed by Brexit?
So, in my opinion, Brexit is an example that will strengthen the European Foundation, and it should do so. And I wouldn't categorize Greece with any other country. So let's try not to generalize different situations. So Greece, the Greeks are overwhelmingly, even during the hardest years of the financial crisis, they were overwhelmingly in favor of euro, overwhelmingly in favor of staying in the European family. So that never changed. Our values never changed because our economic situation had worsened. So that's why, because then you mention other countries and they're in different social and economic and cultural situations. So what do we expect out of this? Obviously, we cannot predict it, because I predicted a lot of things that never happened. Or
what do you want?
What I want is a stronger Europe. What I want is a Europe that will basically take this leave of that member state as a way to reinforce their bonds. And yes, no one says the European Foundation has been perfect, but it has been the best alternative we've ever had in this continent over the last 100 years.
Keith, stronger Europe because Britain, stronger EU because Britain is leaving? The microphone.
Yeah, well, I hope everybody can hear me without me sinking my face into that. I'll come to your question very directly, Humphrey, but it's right, as our questioner put, to see this in an historic context as well. we really do have to remember that the United Kingdom is a set of islands, both geographically and emotionally. We have been at war with our European neighbours for most of the last 1,000 years. And that small strip of water of 22 miles width makes an enormous difference between our attitude and that of many of our partners in the European Union and Europe as a whole. And it is for that reason that I believe a lot of the last 3 years in negotiation have been wasted, because we've never really appreciated the European concept and what makes Europe so important to our neighbours. It's arguable that they could have done more to try to understand us, but I'm concentrating on this country. We have never understood why freedom of movement has such sanctity as it does in Europe. Why? Because in living memory, every single one of those countries in Europe has seen foreign troops on their land and atrocities committed. We haven't experienced that arguably before, since then, but mostly since 1,000 years. And so there is a very, very big different attitude. There is also this belief, I think somewhat subliminally, neo-colonialistically, being bred within Britain, having had the largest empire the world has ever seen, but also this mythology that somehow we stood alone against Hitler and therefore we are capable of surviving on our own. Now, when you put that as a backdrop to the attitudes, and attitudes are important because they fashion the way in which debate is conducted, then you realise some of the difficulties. The other thing is, as we pointed out, that the two main political parties have been in a dichotomy over Europe throughout the last 45 years that we've been a member of the EU. The Labour Party has, I'm afraid, a face of Janus, where it actually wants to be in partnership with our colleagues in terms of safeguarding trade union rights, health and safety standards and things like this. But also, the Labour Party traditionally has always been an international party. It's looked beyond immediate relationships, and now it's having to confront that. The Conservative Party has had that underlying sense of anti-Europeanism, fostered particularly by the tabloid press over the last 45 years, where Europe has been to blame for every ill that's been confronting this country, and that has sunk into the psyche of the British people in a way that I think largely manifested the result three years ago in the referendum. But whilst there has been that ambience of closet anti-Europeanism, we've got to remember that it was Margaret Thatcher who actually created the single European market. It was Margaret Thatcher that, realising that in order to get that through Europe, where one country could have vetoed it, we needed to move to majority voting. And so Britain, under the Conservatives, have actually made a major impact on Europe. Now, Humphrey asked, what are the future? Well, first of all, I'm a free trader by conviction. I don't like protectionism. I think what's going on between China and the United States at the moment is going to end in a vale of tears for both countries and for others as well. Free trade ought to open up opportunities for developing countries and others, but of course free trade has its downside. It has its downside on its own domestic industries. So if Britain is to now engage in free trade agreements with lots of other countries, and I won't talk about the nuances of that with particular large countries such as the United States and whether in fact we'd end up as a client state or not, but looking at the general concept of free trade being a good thing, of course it does mean that the impact of that on some of our domestic industries, not just manufacturing but agriculture and such like, is going to be enormous. And without subsidy almost in perpetuity, which is not allowed under the European Union agreement, but with that sort of subsidy coming from the British government, those industries will wither and die. And that is a decision politically that we have to make as a country. Are we prepared to see our own industry, employment of our own people and things like that, suffer as a result of opening up more to free trade? Or is there some sort of middle way? On institutions, I believe that we will continue, even if tomorrow the deal is voted in favour and we end up leaving on the 31st of October, and there's a big if, I think, over that, but we might come on to that later. But even if that happens, then essentially we are going to have a very close relationship with our European partners, not least because of the volume of trade, apart from anything else. I mean, all our fresh vegetables, in effect, come from Europe, and a whole raft of other things which I could go into, I won't bore you with in detail right now. But that means a close relationship. But what is going to be the nature of that relationship? It's going to be much more a symbiotic one, where there is a lot more of give and take. We have to bear in mind that since 2004, a large number of those Eastern European countries are now members of the EU. Massive disparity in living standards, requiring arguably a considerable subvention from the old Europe into the new Europe in order to bring them up to those living standards, and that includes Greece, of course, as well. But in addition to that, we have to bear in mind that all those countries, again within living memory, were under the hegemony of what was then the Soviet Union. Those countries are not going to want to swap that hegemony of the Soviet Union for some kind of European superstate based in Brussels. So they are people who are going to be driving much more the future of Europe rather than the old six. And that includes the advent countries of those who are queuing up to join. So my answer to Humphrey's question about what is the future of the EU, it's going to be good. The Eurozone may go through a crisis, but the concept of Europe as a collection of states bound together in treaty obligations is going to survive. And what that means is that, of course, the likelihood is, under the influence of those states to which I've made mention, we are going to see far less of the lifetime mission of the likes of first Mr. Delors, then Barnier, and now Juncker, now having gone. We'll have to see what the new Commission comes up with. But the whole concept of ever deepening of Europe, I believe, is now on hold. And we are going to see instead a much greater understanding of where there's give and take in terms of the different nations that constitute the EU.
Thank you. Quick answer,
Quick answer, it took ages. Actually, I've just heard that Juncker might get some executive position after retirement to come back and have an overseeing role in some of his treaty discussions. But anyway, can I just do a couple of quick points?
Yeah.
I am outgunned here. So first of all, the idea of the left. So don't imagine me as like the Labour Party, right? I'm a Marxist. And for me, that means that bizarrely there is some kind of connection here, because I'm not in favour of the state. Yes, I'm not in favour of more state intervention. I'm in favour of freedom and autonomy. I'm against censorship. So in a bizarre world in which we live in today, you have an incredibly censorious left, inverted commas, yes, who want to ban everything, whereas I'm a great believer in expression and personal autonomy and responsibility. So that's one thing. Second thing is, I really think we have to stop saying Europe and European Union as if they're the same thing. Yes, I like Europe. I don't like the EU. I'm against its autocracy, I'm against its anti-democratic nature, and for me that's the important thing. Second thing is, I also don't like the idea of people not understanding. I'm just going to go quickly through a few points. That's all right. Yeah? People didn't understand. People didn't understand what they were voting for, blah, blah, blah. I mean, that's such old...
Yeah, that's not the thing.
No, it wasn't you. It was Pablo said it.
It was Pablo said that.
Yeah. I mean, it was about Greece, but and he didn't say generalise.
Yeah.
And now I'm generalising.
Yeah.
But there is that idea that what I have found, especially if you watch that video with the vice chairman of the Liberal Democrats interviewed by Ian Dale yesterday, it was hilarious. Car crash TV. Because basically, I've always found that the people who have no idea about any of these terms or about European Union are the Remainers, because they've never had to think about it. People who really thought about it were Brexiteers, who decided how they would leave, and they've read and studied. I've met that many that I'm now convinced that they're well informed. So they did know what they were voting for, and they voted to leave the European Union. Yes, and many people explain what that was. In terms of the trade union rights thing you were talking about, I kind of agree with you. That's an old left shibboleth. And in many ways, it's very similar to what's happening with the parliamentary process as well, is that all decisions are kind of outsourced to the European Union. So the Labour Party is now arguing that if we really want to save trade union rights and employment rights and environmental rights, we have to stay in the European Union. Right? The entire history of the Labour Party is almost thrown out of the window that somehow working people have fought for those rights in their own terms. Right? Now, we don't believe we can do that, or we should do that, and we're asking the European Union to guarantee those rights. This is a tragedy.
Okay,
I have so much more to say.
I know you obviously do, but I just wanted to encapsulate where we've got to, and we've got some questions coming, but of the three panellists here that are all from all over the place, I think we've got the idea that Britain is different, because as Keith said, we haven't been occupied, but we also haven't in our minds had to make those Anne Frank type of choices that were made throughout Europe and throughout Yugoslavia and are being made still in many places of the world as to at what stage do you save your family and sacrifice your neighbour? At what stage do you actually support the authoritarian dictatorship that's going after ethnic cleansing, and at which stage we haven't had to make those choices here. So we're all agreed, or the panel has agreed, that Britain is different. So we're now going to explore, we can take some questions, but let's keep in our mind that given that Britain is different, and given what Keith said about the Central and Eastern Bloc, wanting something different too, let's try and think a little bit about what is going to emerge from all that. Question?
Can I have a comment?
Okay.
Can I make a comment?
Oh, very, very quick.
1 minute, okay. I love the diversity of views. I love the debate that is happening. I absolutely respect everybody's viewpoint. What I don't respect is that some of the views, for whether you left or right, is very personal. And it's personal perception. I have a huge, no problem if we have a vote now about whether we stay or we leave. There's debate, there's information, it's not manipulated, it's not facts left out, it's not misogynist forcing decisions on us. And I think there's as many people with the same integrity wanting to remain or wanting to find out as there are people who want to Brexiteer. So I think you need to be very careful, and trashing other parties for trying to bring the debate is not the way forward in a responsible position. So I'm terribly sorry I have to voice that, because I think of the future and the children and the generations, and you've made a rod around people's necks, and we and the poorer population and the human rights, where Britain has been suspectively not as good as they should be, although they preach one thing, we need to face this. It's got a huge impact, and it's got a huge impact on the majority of the people who won't be able to have their second passport and their second home in another country.
All right. Okay. Let's take that. The lady next to that. The question.
Was that a me?
My question is,
We'll go to that in a minute.
I was born at a time before economic community.
This is a comment or a question?
It's to caveat it. So before economic community and economic union. And I remember that we did trade before, and I remember that we did do things. We're doing more things, but I'm interested to know, we're of a different culture, society. What are the implications of actually Great Britain going out there? Who would we form alliances with? Because we can't be forgotten, and I'm interested in, there's too much here for us to be forgotten. Let's look at, I'm interested to hear what kind of countries and what kind of deals that we could do outside if we do leave Brexit, because we won't just fall and flounder. So I'm interested in what kind of countries, what would we do, and how would we move about it?
So we've been in this debate now for 3.5 years, and we still don't have an answer to that question. Is there from our politicians, let's take, yes, yeah.
Sorry, it's a question for the panel.
Good.
And it is about the future, and it's about the future of the relationship between Scotland and the European Union.
Okay.
Because I'd like to remind the panel that the whole of the UK did not vote for Brexit, and there was a very substantial Remain vote in Scotland. So
Okay, why don't we take that, we'll save that question there, because I wanted to tackle that, because in that video that we saw, Robin, there was a phrase that saying and I think that many people there thought that was also a divided nation. So why don't we tackle, from here along, the future of the United Kingdom, and to what extent has this shift damaged that future, and how will that look?
So thank you very much for the question, because that was basically a comment, and thank you for your question as well. It was a comment I wanted to make based on a previous comment of yours, like because you mentioned Yugoslavia and other instances of a big country being separated. I'm like, we shouldn't go that far. We should actually stay here, because I think that the way that an opinion is formed and the way that opinions are expressed by public and through referenda is definitely not to upset social cohesion. So I don't actually think that any British, prior to that referendum, wanted to see their country separated in 2 or 3 or 4.
Austin, was it a yes? Did you, and when you voted, did you anticipate that there could be a risk?
No, nobody did, but I fought for a United Ireland 30 years ago,
Right.
and I was against the Scottish referendum, which was before.
You were against it, so you'd like Scotland and...
No, these are political questions, which I don't have time for.
So just
When it's
just
body
to-
carriage.
but I think it's important because
Yes, and I want to get that right.
Yes.
No, I
So
don't
basically,
interrupt
you were
Malcolm.
against allowing the Scottish people to have a say.
No,
or
no,
against-
I'm a favour of democracy, so you can do what you want, right? I'm against
Oh,
Scotland
you were
being a
against?
separate thing.
Okay, yes, so okay, perfect. So I do think that a side effect of that decision, which hasn't been a concrete decision, because as we've all said, we've been 3 years debating about what this means, about what it means about future relationships of the UK with other nations outside Europe, but also with the European Union. So yes, to answer your question as well, I don't know what the future lies for the UK. I know that a lot of countries will be like hawks waiting for the UK to leave the European Union, so it has to be desperate to form some kind of alliances and get advantage of it. And we've seen Donald Trump actually doing such things. Yes, so, but I cannot speculate of how the UK will end up negotiating its position. Maybe they will do it brilliantly, and they will form free trade agreements that will be in favour of the UK economy and not against, which it remains to be seen.
Let me try to answer Sally's question. First of all, I start on the premise that unity is better than separation.
Absolutely.
That doesn't mean to say you occlude conflict, so long as it's dialectic, so long as it is not taken to armed force. Conflict can be highly beneficial, and all sorts of good things can emanate from a difference of views. But it always amazes me that how the United Kingdom has somehow stuck together in a strange way, mirroring the attitude of many of the Commonwealth countries towards Britain, which is not an inimical one, it's actually one of friendship. How is it that when those countries were conquered by main force and terrible things done, how was it when the Welsh didn't really have much choice about joining England? When is it that all sorts of unmentionable things were done in Ireland by Oliver Cromwell, leaving a legacy of hate, and I'm not even talking about 1916 and thereafter. Why is it that, notwithstanding the Battle of Culloden and what Sweet William did to the Scots, somehow we've managed to keep together and bury the hatchet that has been born out of history? It is out of, I believe, that concept of self-interest showing that actually the whole is far better than the sum of the parts. And, again, you have to look back at Scotland, where, frankly, the Scots didn't have much choice about joining England as well. In 1707, it was because Scotland was bankrupt, because they'd all put their money into the Darien scheme in Panama, and lost all their money, and they came with a begging bowl.
So is
frankly, England bailed them out.
Is the Union now in trouble?
Well, what worries me is this. And I think, funnily enough, rather than looking at Scotland, I'd look first at Northern Ireland. Because under the New Deal, which I have to say, is based upon a concept that both Theresa May and Boris Johnson repeatedly have said they would never contemplate, and that is to have one country, two systems, with Northern Ireland being within the UK economy, but also within the EU customs union as well. If the Northern Irish take the view that Westminster has turned its back on them, and they look across the border, which nobody can really discern where it lies anyway, and decide that their lot might be better going in with a prosperous Republic of Ireland, then it's going to come down as to who can bribe the Northern Irish most, because that's what the DUP support has been all about.
Exactly.
Bribery. They've been bribed to support the government, or not, as it turned out to be the case. Now, at the moment, Northern Ireland is the most heavily subsidised part of Europe. Why? Because the money is coming in from the European Union. Once we're out of the European Union, if we are, that money is going to have to be provided by the Westminster government in perpetuity, for fear of there being a border poll, which successive British governments have said they would always honour the result of, a border poll in Northern Ireland saying we would prefer to be in the Republic. Now, if that were to happen, what's going to happen in Scotland? I mean, they're going to say, we'd like a bit of that as well, thank you very much indeed. If you're creating a capacity for Northern Ireland to stay within the single market of the European Union, we, the Scots, who voted overwhelmingly to remain in the EU, want to have a deal whereby we can remain in the EU as well.
Do you have a figure for the amount of money that we would have to
I don't.
put in?
No,
in the billions or the
Oh,
tens of billions?
in the billions. Because there's so much cross-subsidisation going on anyway in a somewhat under the carpet way that it's very difficult to discern and come to concrete figures on that. But it would be a massive amount. And you would then end up with Great Britain, in effect, being synonymous with the way most my American friends describe us anyway, as England. And we just remain as England. How important is England going to be, to answer another question, as a trading partner around the world, when we now live, whether we like it or not, it's the reality, we live in the concept of trading blocks. You've got China, you've got the United States, you've got the European Union, you've got ASEAN. The European Union, Mercosur, you've got 500 million people living in the European Union. That is a trading bloc more strong than the United States or the capacity in terms of its economy, China as well.
Okay,
it has great clout. Once we start leaving, if it were to break up, then that clout goes.
So Brexit puts the union at risk in both of your views, Austin?
Well, absolutely. I mean, and I wouldn't stop with England. I mean, I think that there would be a tendency for Cornwall, for Northumberland. I'm not saying this is a good thing, this is a terrible thing. And the fragmentation would be intense, the pressure would be intense. But it does, see, for me it goes back, it's not about trading blocks, or it's not about, politicking and people being bought off. As it happens, the DUP have been thrown under a bus by this deal in the last 2 days. In many ways, many Remainers have been thrown under a bus as well. I think you'll find. But actually, it's about, for me, about the nation state rather than the super state, and it's about democracy. So the whole, for me, the idea is that, let's go back to that vote again, right? The vote has not been honoured. The democratic process has not been honoured. And if basically you have a situation where you realise, and especially when you talk about the majority of people in this country who took part in that vote, for many of those people, all they have as a political tool, as a political voice, is that vote. Yes, they don't run the media, they don't have petitions on panels like we do, and all the rest of it, right? They have the vote, which is, and that has to be taken seriously, and it hasn't. And it hasn't.
In a democracy, are people entitled to change their mind?
Of course. Of course.
And what-
But what
I think
happens
that should
first?
be a separate
And what
topic.
happens first? Hang on, stories, because we've had this on all the talk shows.
Yeah.
So I'm going to stop.
No, but that's a terrible thing to say,
There's
right?
now a
Because
majority in favour of remaining in
what-
the EU.
hang on,
I'm going to stop you. I'm going to separate you. But Austin, I've got a question as a Marxist. You're a Marxist.
Okay.
Is democracy coming
Exactly.
in now? Is the sort of freedom and all of this is not what we or the rest of us see Marxism to be. Can
yeah, that's pretty clear, isn't it? Right? I'm not a Stalinist, right? So, right, read your Marx and ask me afterwards, right? But the point is, we have to have this clear, right?
Yeah.
So I'm a Democrat, right? Fundamentally a Democrat. I'm a humanist. I'm a Democrat, and that means I put humanity first, right? And I put democracy first. So the idea that yes, you can change your mind, of course, I can change my mind tomorrow, right? I understand all of that. However, if you have anything meaningful where somebody makes a decision, especially the biggest vote in history in this country, and you do not implement it, and you tell people to change their minds, right, have another go, that is not democratic, right? That is a denial of the democratic vote. Once you've implemented it, carry on, right? Argue it just right. So the second thing is Scotland.
But your division into Yorkshire and Cornwall and whatever, just play that out a little more.
Well, I'd argue that Scotland, right? So like I say, I was opposed to to Scotland separating away, and as it happens, the majority of Scottish people were too. Yes, Scotland lost that vote, which means that they were part of the broader national referendum, which was Brexit. So whenever people say Scotland didn't vote for Brexit, too bad. Because actually, you were part of a national vote, because a year earlier, you voted to be part of that broader national agenda. So you can't cherry pick where you want to redraw your democratic lines.
I just want to, just before I let you come in there, just for a second, just come in for a second, and then we can wrap up this one, and I want to move on to another topic after that. Off you go.
So first of all, just to reply to that, Scotland voted to remain in the UK because the major argument by the Westminster government is that but if you leave the UK, you are going to leave the European Union. So this is what Scottish voted for. They said,
are you serious?
yes,
That's what they voted
of
for.
course, this is what they voted for.
If somebody spent a long time on that campaign,
if somebody
that
would
never
tell
came
them,
up. It never came
I
up.
bet my head off. If somebody would tell them that a year from now you are going to vote to stay in that union and that union is going to exit the European Union, I'm sure what the vote would have been.
Right, I think we've got just a second. I want to just wrap up where we are, because our panel, as lively as they are agreeing on a lot of things according to my notes. Firstly, is that Britain is slightly separate from Europe in the what I call the Anne Frank occupying case. Secondly, is I think everybody agrees that the Union is in trouble. Brexit has put the Union in trouble.
That's right.
So, Margaret, a quick question, and then
I
I want
want-
to move
I
on
want
to...
to ask-
Just 1 second, Margaret. You can't get away with that. Brexit has put the union in trouble.
That's what
Yes, it is.
you said.
No.
You said it yourself.
No, I didn't say that. No, I think you go back on the tape, you'll find I didn't say that, right? We have Brexit, all these things are happening, there is a fragmentation going on.
So
But the
you're
idea
in
that
trouble
Brexit
anyway.
has somehow kind of... No, right. So we didn't vote to break up the country, right?
No.
So there are repercussions, and those repercussions, those tensions, that fragmentation,
Yes.
have been latent for a long time. Yes?
Yes.
So it's not Brexit, it may have given expression to it, but...
Yeah,
I'm sorry for that.
No, the fact that
My question is
the fact that the seventh largest economy in the world is about to leave the European Union
is a big thing.
is going to have a massive impact on the EU.
Everywhere.
You can't deny it.
My question is to Austin.
Yes.
I just want to ask you, human being to human being, if you can put your hand on your heart and say that all ex-Brexiteers knew exactly what they were doing. I would say to you, this is wrong, because I've spoken to a lot of Brexiteers as well. So therefore, as my friend Keith said, are we not allowed to change our mind? You said yes. Why are you so much against the second referendum? If you're so sure that they knew what they were doing, they will all vote the same thing again. Then you still have the belief. So what's the problem?
As the host of this beautiful gathering, that's fine, but we're not going to debate that, because otherwise we're going back to every talk show.
I mean, you said you knew that the Brexiteers had studied. You know
No, he's a Democrat. He's in favour of a second referendum to make sure people know exactly what it is they're voting for.
Exactly.
Ironically, we have to nail this, right? A second referendum is anti-democratic. It's
No,
anti-democratic.
Austin,
If
we
you
can't,
don't
it's
understand
unnameable.
the-
We're not going to
you
name
have to understand the nature of democracy,
Okay.
right?
I would-
It has to be implemented, otherwise it means nothing.
All right, I want to move on a little bit to what effect this is going to have on defence. So a lot of people that I've spoken to in the past 3 years have insisted that NATO is what has kept Europe safe after the Second World War, not the European Union. My response is that whenever you're dealing with an insurgency or something, there's always a military and a political solution to it, and that is in fact what NATO and the EU are. Britain and France are the big players on the global stage in Europe. We've got at the moment Turkey stretching the bounds of NATO by committing alleged war crimes and invading another country yet being a NATO member. So that's, and also Turkey breaking away from European Union values when during the referendum they were going to join the European Union and we were going to be flooded by them. So I'd like to start, let me start with Austin again and we can come back, I think, but we'll cut down our little time. But how do you see the whole NATO alliance, Western democracy values, the defence of that with those structures? Will they be retained? Will they be put at risk?
As a result of Brexit?
Not as a result of Brexit, because I think we can, just to redefine the thing, is that the other thing that the panel agrees on is that there's been a simmering of feeling all around the world, actually, and particularly here in Britain, because we are slightly different, and that the referendum lanced the boil. And that lancing has been happening all, Japan and Korea, is happening. Trump is in the States. There's all sorts of stuff going on which is changing the debate in many countries. So let's say it's not because of Brexit or whatever. Let's just look and see how those defence structures in Europe are going to play out.
Well, and I've got, if we're going down to minutiae, I have some document here which talks about how during the transitional period, UK sovereignty will be restricted by the treaty, so the UK will not be allowed to take any actions likely to conflict with or impede EU foreign policy. So ironically, we're out. I mean, some people have said it earlier on that there is such a thing as such a bad deal that it's maybe better
Is
to
this
stay
different
in.
to what it is now? We can indeed,
Influence. We can have. We cannot prejudice the decision-making autonomy of the EU by our actions. So, in some ways, foreign policy is being kind of we're slightly removed from EU foreign policy as some kind of super state which is now looking for a European army, which I don't think anybody in Remain voted for, by the way. But I just think that there's the military defence of Europe. I'm slightly worried about the discussion about geopolitics with a war mentality, even though I kind of see that there's something simmering on the horizon here. Right? I do think that when we talk, for example, when we talk about free movement, which was raised earlier, I'm a big fan. I'm a big fan of free movement. I'm also a big fan of the fact that of sovereignty. And what sovereignty means is that you can then make a decision as to what your immigration policy will be. My immigration policy would be open borders. Okay? Now that would be a political argument. At the moment, we don't have the authority to have that conversation. And what you then have is the European superstate has a border with Turkey, you just mentioned, where Turkey gets paid billions, $335 billion, to, in many ways, safeguard the fence which would put Donald Trump to shame. The Mexican border has got nothing on the European border with Turkey, right, which stops all those kind of nuisance people coming in. So we have freedom of movement in a very kind of European, cosy way, but in fact we don't have global freedom of movement. I'm a big believer in freedom of movement, full stop, right, globally. But I find that actually the European Union has an incredibly hostile relationship to the rest of the world. Yes, from Africa, people who are dying, investing in Libya to keep people in detention camps is quite horrendous. That's what I'm going to say. So let's not pretend that the European Union is some kind of harmonious kind of bloc which favours people moving around the place. It might favour kind of architects coming from Germany and working in Angel. But fundamentally, there are certain people, Polish people, who've complained, who talk about the fact that freedom of movement is really good because you can now move from Poland and get a job as a plumber or barmaid or wherever it is in London. The people who remain in Poland are really annoyed, right, that there's a complete destruction of the employment base. People are moving to make their money and going away. This is a kind of a neoliberal, everything that the left normally criticise, they're celebrating. This is a neoliberal economic policy where people are being forced to move from low-wage economies to high-wage economies, not because of anything decent and wonderful about their better improved living standards, but because that's the nature of the poverty that they find in their own economies. So all I'm saying is I just think that there's tensions within Europe which I think will out. As well as
they'll exacerbate, will they? They'll get...
Well, I mean, there's Catalonia, you mentioned Turkey, Hungary, there's a million and one problem. I think the Gilets jaunes is teaching people a lesson if we're only allowed to see it on the news. So I think that there are all kinds of kind of problems which are occurring within Europe. The recession in Germany is not very good for harmony, the fragmentation of the Italian politics, all these things are, you know...
And where does it, just to wrap, how does that lie with the NATO, EU, the general defence of Europe, or the original point there? Is there anything that's going to change in that, or will NATO stay as it is, or give us
I have no idea, but I've got a funny feeling it might start to feel the pinch as well. I'm not a big fan of supranational institutions.
Yeah. Okay. Keith?
I have some sympathy with the views expressed about freedom of movement and fortress Europe. I think the way one of the biggest recent failures of Europe has been the inability to address the refugee crisis in a humane way. The removal of the Mare Nostrum concept of actually saving people from North Africa in the sea, the Mediterranean, and the thousands of deaths of people who drowned in rickety boats is, for me, a permanent stain on the EU's inability to come to any kind of solution there. And when you think of it at its height, okay, Germany accepted 1 million refugees. At its height, the people coming even from all the war-torn zones such as Libya, Syria and such like amounted in a year to about 1 million people. Accommodating 1 million people in the total population of 500 million is nothing. And it should have been achieved, and it should have been done in a far, far better way than it has. So I have some view about that. Moving on to the defence side, I think it's important to bear in mind that France and Britain are two of the permanent 5 members in the Security Council with the veto, and conventionally they have voted the same way, taking account of the views of the EU member states. Now, that is a question, to my mind, has not been addressed at all. I've not heard anybody talk about how Britain might then exercise its vote in the permanent 5 of the UN if it is no longer a member of the EU. But I think on top of that, you have to bear in mind also that it is not NATO that has preserved the peace in Europe. It is the European Union and membership of the European Union that has stopped people traditionally for over 1,000 years tearing each other to pieces. Twice in the last century, I mean, remember that, twice in the last century, we've had 75 years of peace, unprecedentedly. My generation is the first generation that has not had to go to war for hundreds of years with somebody in Europe. And that is something, and when I sat as serving in the military on what was then known as the inner German border before the DDR became part of the Federal Republic, and looked across the divide at the Russian or Soviet Union as it then was, Third Shock Army going back several divisions, and we knew that we didn't stand much of a chance. I realised there that the cause of conflict was a massive misunderstanding between the East and the West, but it was the solidarity within Europe, it was the close integration of trading and mercantile interests that actually kept that solid and ensured that there wasn't going to be breakout. I mean, look at, I mean, you know, it's exemplified now, isn't it, with what's going on with Turkey. I mean, NATO hasn't exactly managed to stop what could be a breakup of itself. And when I talked to a lady MP from Latvia, from Estonia, who represents part of Tallinn, and I said to her, look, please tell me that I am mad, that to stay awake at night is crazy, in the understanding that Putin could one day test NATO in the same way as Hitler caused the Second World War by invading Poland on a pretext. Please tell me that Putin is not going to one day say 1/3 of Estonia being ethnic Russians feel being battened down upon by the Estonian government and therefore the tanks roll in to Central Square, Tallinn. I said, you must tell me that I'm mad. And she said that is precisely the planning scenario that we have.
So just is NATO supplementary then to European cohesion and peace, or is it a totally separate operation, or how does it?
No, I think at the end of the day, if you look at some of the conflicts, particularly in the Balkans, it's actually been the European countries that have been in the forefront of not only stopping the bloodshed, but also then trying to seek a solution. As the EU,
using NATO as its...
yes, rather than NATO, those initiatives were from the EU, not from NATO. So, I mean, we should never ever forget the peaceful implications of the EU and what it has achieved for Europe.
So, I come from a generation which we are called the millennials, right? And so we see, we understand, we feel things differently. So, at least to me and the people in my generation that I speak about, NATO is nothing more than a military alliance in the sense of sharing expertise, sharing capabilities, sharing resources a lot of times, and has nothing to do with what the European Foundation is about, which for me is about creating that social cohesion that prevents conflicts. So, and traditionally, I haven't seen NATO actually preventing conflicts. Or they were they were behind, let's say, behind the circumstances, trying to fix things instead of preventing them.
Okay.
So I've seen that happening, trying to mediate a conflict instead of preventing a conflict to begin with. So, and this is what the European Union, throughout its history, has managed to do, is to bring people, bring nations, bring civilizations of different backgrounds together and align them towards a common goal to avoid this kind of conflicts. And
Sorry, just tell us a little bit about Turkey, because where do you see that lying? Firstly, because during the referendum campaign we were told that Turkey was going to join the European Union, and now the NATO. Where is it lying?
This is why I say that that campaign about Brexit was based on so many lies, inaccuracies, and down the line that I find it absurd to say that people are well informed when somebody stands in the UK and says Turkey will join the European Union, which is far from truth, because it's not just the UK which would oppose it. There are a number of members for different reasons, and Turkey is so far away in its European journey than it was illustrated. So it was illustrated as if Turkey would join in the next enlargement round.
And should Turkey stay in NATO?
So Turkey has been a member of NATO for quite some time, and my opinion is that we should embrace different countries that they could pose a threat, not tear them apart, not throw them away, because that would have the exact opposite effect. So I would say that it is quite turbulent. The time is quite turbulent, and just to refer to your immigration point. So I'm totally in favor of what Keith said, that we're talking about maybe 1 million, 2 million immigrants in a 500 million society. How could they not be absorbed and treated well and integrated? I agree with that. The reason is that current regulation, which we try to reform at the European level, just puts all of the burden of that social cohesion and integration towards the member states who sit at the border. So frankly, Greece, Italy, Spain. And there are a number of countries, of European Union countries in the center of Europe, that they've opposed the idea of basically take accountability for a share of these immigrants and integrate them in their societies. And that's why I feel that we could do more as Europeans to actually tackle this immigration problem more holistically, and actually not talk about it as a problem, but actually as a sustainable way to treat it, because it's not sustainable.
And let me just make this very quick point. Do remember, perhaps the best example of the EU being able to accommodate conflict is the fact that Cyprus is a member state. And you think of the difference between the Turks and the Greeks on the island of
And
Cyprus.
they rejected Kofi Annan's peace plan. And they're still
Exactly,
trying.
and it is still a member of the European Union. That, I think, speaks volumes.
So I think we've got two elements here on the defence question. One is the internal divisions within Europe, in which immigration is possibly the most serious catalyst. And secondly is the external threat, mainly from Russia, of which NATO has been there to offset that. But there's not a great deal of disagreement in the panel, is there, on these two issues? Austin, because these two are in agreement, do you have a disagreement there with it, on immigration being a sort of pivotal issue?
Yeah, I don't want the European Union, well, I don't think the European Union should be in a position to tell nation states how many people they should take.
Even the ones at the borders,
Of course.
so they have to be absorbed by the ones at the borders?
No.
Yeah.
Take a step back. Let's look at it to a different lens, right? So I'm saying nation states should have control, as a sovereign power, sovereign nation, you should be able to determine an immigration strategy. Now, I'm a liberal on this, right? So I'm a great believer in openness. However, I understand that some countries, for whatever reasons, for poverty, for the fact that there is no jobs anyway, they're a terrible situation in the southern states of Italy, southern provinces of Italy. So, there may be an internal political conversation, right? Which should be a sovereign democratic conversation.
Yes, it's about burden sharing, isn't it? I mean, when you're in a partnership, you agree certain benefits come to you by pooling your sovereignty. But by the same token, you have to accept certain burdens have to be shared. And why is it that the southern Mediterranean states have had to take the full brunt of the flow simply for geographical reasons, when Sweden's taken a lot of Syrian refugees, we know. But Britain's commitment has been pathetic in terms of actually taking people, and other nations says as well. I mean, the Italians, for understandable reasons, have been shunting people through to France. The French have been trying to get rid of them. We're quite happy to see them trying to go on flimsy boats and get over to here and things like this. I mean, this is a real failure. But I go back to something on the question that you raised about defence. And of course, we know now that there is a strong move in Europe to have a European defence force, led principally by the French. Now, the British have traditionally been against that. They see NATO as the guarantor of those freedoms rather than a European defence force. But again, when I served in the military, I knew the reason we wanted to keep American troops on German soil is because as soon as the first body bag went back to the United States, that meant the US was committed wholly to the defence of Europe. We are now seeing an isolationist policy coming from the President of the United States, saying Europe should look after its own. He's even been dictating how much of our gross domestic product we should be spending on defence as well. And it's quite clear that he wants to pull out not just from Turkey and Syria, but he wants to pull out from Europe as well. How is Europe going to handle that? Frankly, I'm afraid I think we are looking inevitably at Europe having to do what the President is saying they should be doing, and that is looking to their own defence. And maybe it's high time that was done.
Okay, let's do the open to the floor again. I've got a couple more in my back pocket. Gentleman at the back. A question or a comment?
No, it's a question.
Thank you.
I think in the whole debate, what was completely missed out, and especially by Brexiteers, is the fact that Britain has its own currency. They're not members of the Schengen agreement, and therefore they have control of their borders. Now, unfortunately, when Mr. Cameron went to negotiate with the EU at the beginning, he did not agree on certain issues like if there was mass movement of people coming in from the EU countries, what the status would be and how would they be accommodated in the UK, and UK citizens living in Europe. So and I'm sorry, but I disagree with the gentleman that Brexiteers were well informed and Remainers were not. I think in this 3.5-year process since...
This is a question about, or a comment?
Well, basically it's a question that have we ignored the fact that Britain has its own currency? We're not members of Euro. We have our own immigration controls. We're not members of the Schengen. So why is it that this issue is being such a big issue in terms of Brexit?
Then if I may say so, it goes way beyond that. We live in a privileged penumbral position with Europe that is enjoyed by no other member state.
Exactly.
And that has gone without proper debate. We have total exemptions from justice and home affairs matters. We have, as you say, the exemption that John Major got from actually having been a commitment to join the currency. We had the rebate that Margaret Thatcher got. We are living in a situation where we're only half in Europe anyway. And yet we're having this great debate about leaving it. We will never ever regain that privileged status again if we leave and then we decide one day we might want to come back.
I disagree with that.
Yeah.
So therefore we shouldn't leave.
I settled in this country in 1990 and it was Great Britain, and I think now with the trade and we will win again independence, we'll be back to Great Britain. What do you think?
Can you say that again? I didn't quite catch it. Just...
When I settled here, it was Great Britain, and then a little bit changes. We are not kind of Great Britain. My feeling when we now after Brexit and we'll be back as Great Britain, especially after the trade things, and we will win independence again and
Independence?
yeah, for trading.
When we are not independent?
Well, for trade as UK,
It'll make us
we'll
really
be winning the independence again. The trade will be really better.
So this is about make Britain great again?
Yes, by...
Okay.
I think I should point out the blindingly obvious that Great Britain has nothing to do with its status. It's all about geography.
Just to know if I'm...
We'll come back after us if there's some
So
confusion in the
I
question.
spent much of this year in the Western Balkans where, as you mentioned, nations are lining up to join. But they're all small. And I wonder if, is it feasible to think of a European Union with two divisions? I mean, in football, if you always play against people who are bigger and powerful and lose all the time, you're going to be unhappy. And, I think there's a fundamental problem that we're trying to make equality between nations that are not equal in population, in capacity, and is there not some different type of union or combination that the panel will see?
This is a big question, which we were going to get. So you took the one out of my back pocket in a way, but it wraps up some of the other things we were saying. I just want to encapsulate it a little bit, is that if you talk about the football or CEO of a multinational, if you lose something as big as Britain in the match, then you have you look and see at the structures of what you've got, how it's working, how you change the team players so that it doesn't happen again. As far as I know, the European Union hasn't done that. And what Britain has reflected, as we've decided, as we've worked out here, is this simmering of discontent that stretches. I know you slightly disagree with that, but we have similar discontent in Britain, and then we have the eastern blocks, so sort of Hungary and Poland and Catalonia. There's stuff going on all over there that doesn't seem to have been taken on board by the executives of the European Union. So I think this is the point you've made is should there be a two-tier one, but let's widen it out a little bit and say that if you, Austin, were sitting in Jean-Claude Juncker's seat on the day after the referendum came through, but you're not him, you're you, what would you have done to make sure that the European project survives?
I know this is probably the plot of your next book, Humphrey, so I can't indulge that because obviously I wouldn't be doing that, would I? So I can't even fetishize about that question.
I'll pass it on to Keith if you don't.
No, I'm going to tell you something else. Look, I genuinely think the question about money, I saw, was it Nigel Lawson, Dominic Lawson, yesterday on TV, basically just simply banging on and saying it's not about the money. Right? So I understand that there will be difficulties if we leave, there'll be problems, there'll be fractiousness, there'll be, repercussions. I understand all that. It's not meant to be a smooth thing, even though maybe Cameron said that for the first year. But ultimately, it's going to be difficult. First of all, I don't think we're going to leave properly, so maybe it's a moot point. However, but leaving is about honouring the democratic mandate, which was voted for. No, I know, but nobody seems, and I'm afraid you want to ignore it and stay, right? So that's the point. And once, well, that's what you're asking.
No, I accept the nuances and you don't. That's a,
no. Leave and remain. It's not a nuance. It's not a nuance. Hang on, it's my point.
If you had a referendum,
we'll take a minute and let these two have
the point for the lady who said about Great Britain, I think it's quite important. Now, I'm not a patriot, I'm not a nationalist, right? And I think Great Britain is a label, it's a, whatever you want it to be. But I do think that the idea that there is a potential here, right, for something to happen. I think what we've done in the last 3 years is kind of talked at, whether it's Project Fear on one side, or whether it's just a general perception that we're going to hell in a handcart and we're not in control of anything and what have you. And the Extinction Rebellion conversation hasn't helped matters, where we see, 8 years' time we're all going to die. So I think that there's a real sense of miserablism and trepidation in society. And I think that had we taken the initiative and said this is a fantastic potential opportunity rather than a potential devastation. If we'd seen it as an opportunity where we could have created something, we could have made network, we could have built something. I wrote an article where I was talking about there's a potential to revolutionise the construction industry. Where we build houses, and we build fewer houses today than we did in 1927. But when if we're building houses by putting one brick on top of another, there has been no revolution in the construction industry. There's a potential to rethink our relations, not just with the wider world, but even internally.
This is to make Britain great again. I want to come to Pavlos here because I really want to stick to this concept of can I ask you this, if you were heading the EU, there's a dozen different things that you could be heading, and Britain just leaves, what would you have thought the day after about the structures of the European Union?
So I'm going to leave the first part, which is like being...
Nobody wants to answer this question.
Because it is a hypothetical question in a hypothetical argument. But what I want to answer this.
No, it's not that hypothetical. Because it's been asked directly.
Yes. So basically, I want to answer that question. So the EU has the structures for member states to go on a European journey, and yes, they won't be fully integrated from day one. Croatia joined. They didn't join the euro straight away. You need to implement structures to strengthen their economy, to make them ready to join the common currency, and then do so. But you cannot begin entering a union without having a vision to fully integrate the member states. So is this going to take time? Yes, it will take time. But it doesn't mean that because in football terms, as you mentioned, you have a lower qualified team and a higher qualified team, you don't inspire that lower qualified team to actually be as high as the high qualified team. So that is on your point, and I think that the structures are there to not push member states beyond their means just to integrate them. May I just say on the Great Britain argument? So I think this is why I really oppose the way that the Leave campaign conducted themselves, because they weren't basing their arguments on facts, but rather on sentiment. You know, if you're half patriotic, half, you know, like loving your country, these kind of statements, make them great again, you know, take back control, you know, sound good in your ears, because, you know, you feel that that's the right thing. But without backing this with reality, which is that nobody will, as Kit said, you know, the UK had already a privileged position within the EU, one which we never have under any free trade agreement, simply because the European Union will seek their own interest and not the UK's anymore, and the UK will not have a voice to influence that. However, I think that basing it on facts, on reality, will actually be a good education for all of us on how we conduct ourselves in public life, because there has been a lot of talk about, you know, sentimental talk, like trying to touch the feeling, the emotion, and people responded to that. And this is where we are right now. It's called populism, and it happens all around Europe.
Of course we have a multi-speed Europe. For a start, we've got 17 members of the Eurozone, and the others are not. So they are moving at a different pace. I mean, they've talked within the Eurozone of strengthening the ECB, which would then impinge on fiscal policy, you know, sovereignty to determine a nation's own budget and things of that nature. And as Pavlos rightly said, you know, with the advent of widening, excuse me, rather than deepening of the EU, we brought on board a whole load of countries which were way out of kilter in terms of the standard. I remember going skiing in Bulgaria the year before they joined, and the skiing was so terrible that, unlike us, we took a day out, and we took the bus from Borovitz to Plovdiv, about an hour's journey, going right the way along a fairly ramshackle road, passing field after field after field. Not a single sign anywhere of a piece of mechanical machinery. It was all the ploughs were being drawn by horses, like they had done for thousands of years. And I turned to my wife and I said, the amount of money that's going to have to go into this country to try to even begin to bring it up to the standard of living of the old one is going to be massive. But that is what the European Union is all about. It's taking countries which are at different speeds but want to join because they enjoy the concept of the European Union, and therefore helping them to develop in that particular way. I mentioned the subsidies in Northern Ireland. You know, other parts of the EU are being heavily subsidised from Brussels, precisely for that reason, the European Development, the Regional Development Fund. I'm sorry, Humphrey, I am provoked. I cannot allow our friend here to get away with the will of the people. Okay?
You didn't say that.
The will of the people. Right.
He didn't say.
Well, I'm glad he didn't, because the will of the people has been the argument of dictators throughout the years. Hitler spoke about the will of the people. And what I'm saying is you have such certainty about people knowing what they voted for 3 years ago. I pose to you, if there was a question on something less complicated...
We're going backwards again.
Well, less complicated, say the death penalty, the reintroduction of the death penalty, and there was a majority in favour of that. How would you know whether those people were voting for exceptions for people who are mentally ill, for police officers, for murder of prison guards, or whatever? You wouldn't.
You can have 10 seconds because this is a backwards conversation.
No, it's very important, right? Yeah. Because two things have just happened.
It's nothing to do
One
with
is I've been accused of saying something which I didn't say, and secondly, I've been given a comparison with Hitler. And this is, I mean, this is beyond... No. This is beyond despicable. Beyond despicable, right? And that's the level that we're operating at. So the idea about facts is something, I'm afraid, which I am now profoundly disgusted by, what you just said.
All right, can I toss... I'm going to let this lady here be a little bit like Britain and get a second question. But I just want to toss an idea out that's come up about this, about structures, Marxist structures, capitalist structures, whatever they are. Is it a case that when you're dealing with sovereignty and the flexibility and independence against regional structures, people have to have agreements between each other, that there is a level that you can't push against? You mentioned the Commonwealth, Keith. Well, the Commonwealth signs up to great things, but and democracy and all that, and they've pushed under the carpet the colonial atrocities so they can be photographed with the Queen every year, the leaders. But actually they don't do much, because if they did do much, they would come up against precisely the sort of problems that the European Union comes against. ASEAN the same. They tried to create SEATO and other things, but they decided to keep it as a low, consensus-driven regional organisation that knew how far it could go. Is it the case that the European Union has in fact gone as far as you can go when you're dealing with issues like sovereignty, like trade agreements and all that sort of thing, and gone too far? I don't want an answer to that, I just want to think about it. We can bring it up in debate, but you've got the floor.
Thank you, sorry, strong opinion, so apologies.
And I apologise, that wasn't directly personal.
No, but what I want to say is, we talk about the idealism of when we are, Great Britain has exited, we are going to then be able to build the houses that we want. My question is, why haven't we done anything to date? The army is the smallest, it's disinvested basically on the security. Most of the ships and the armory that we have to use, not made in this country. Contracts given out everywhere. You just have to look at Oxford Street as a good example. You have to look at the sense of what's going on in the economy as a good example. We've had the opportunity to be the greatest, as you mentioned, and if you think about it, you talk about football and having to be inclusive, and the smaller clubs can't compete. The smaller clubs are actually investing in the best coaches, which are not British, to come in and bring them up to speed, which is basically what the European concept is, by including smaller countries at different levels. So we have to think a little bit broader. We have had the opportunity. We just have to look at the economy at the present time and where is the money going to come from. Think of the students, think of the universities, think of the disinvestment that's going on. Car manufacturers, people unemployed.
So essentially your question here is, why hasn't Britain been doing what it says it can do?
Yes.
Why hasn't it been building those houses anyway?
But it's had the opportunity.
Because it could have done, and the EU wasn't stopping it doing it. Your thoughts on?
Well, you know, my thoughts are not going to be why it didn't build houses before. It's going to be why the UK didn't celebrate the opportunities given to them as a nation by the European Union. And I think that blame game, that whatever good was happening, it was the government, the local government that was implementing it, but whatever bad was happening, it was always the EU that was behind it. Was a blame game that has been happening for, if not for decades, in my opinion. So it's not only the years that led to the referendum. So, and that's why there was this perception by the British public of not appreciating what the European Union is about, because nobody had communicated what the European Union is about. Most of the people started getting excited or interested to understand what it's about when the referendum campaign started. And there you heard everything. You've heard truths, you heard lies, you heard inaccuracies, and you have to deal with that, and you have to filter in your mind what you thought was right without having an understanding of how the European institutions work. And yes, I'm not going to say that everything is perfect. So, but always, and that has always been our opinion as an organization, is that you improve something through participation.
That's right.
You improve something through influencing. And Britain has the opportunity to influence key decisions in the European Union, in their favor, of course, right? Because, you know, they are a member state, they will look after themselves. So they had the opportunity to influence decisions at the European level. They had the opportunity to gain advantage over other European Union members over the decades that this foundation has been developed.
So, Austin, as the lever, I guess, to call you, why could Britain not build the houses? What has the EU stopped it from doing at that sort of basic level?
That wasn't my point.
No, but that's the question.
Well, my
no, it doesn't make any sense.
Britain had the opportunity
I heard the question.
to invest in the industrial,
I got the question.
to invest in
I wrote a very good
and to
article about
invest
it.
in the homes. And it's Britain's decision the way they gave the contracts out and everything, and the decisions to disinvest in the manner that they had. You can't just blame it now on leaving and we're going to do everything right. Everything that we have in this group is
the point has been made. I'm really keen to get the answer.
But the
What about the
simplicity
houses?
is the
Why
houses.
does Britain not build the houses and then say it can build them after we leave the EU?
I don't really think the audience wants me to go into a diatribe about the last 100 years of construction industry in this country, right? Because in many ways,
but has leaving
no, that
does
wasn't my
leaving the
point.
EU enable us to build houses?
It allows us to think differently. That's the
Okay.
point. It allows us to think, this is a rupture. Yes, and I appreciate it's a rupture, which could go horribly wrong, or it could go brilliantly well. I understand that. That's what happens in these moments. No, no, it's a democratically decided position that we.
No, but
You
there
won't
are risks.
deny it.
There are risks.
Of course there's risks.
Can I just get this right so that we can all agree on the premise there? That it's not the fact that they were stopped from building the houses. It's the fact that the mindset changes, so they are now motivated to build the houses and go out and do things they weren't doing.
Look, as an aside, I'm going to move away from the subject. I went to a meeting with British Gas, okay, about 2 weeks after the referendum. And most people, if you remember those days, most people were in tears in those days. Yes, people were weeping in the streets, as were a lot of these people I was going to meet. And the woman who was in charge of marketing, I mean, not in charge of full British Gas, but the London area, came back and said they'd just come back from a meeting where they were deciding on what maybe energy or gas policy could be when we leave the European Union. And then they had this kind of moment where they all thought, actually that's the first time we've actually had this conversation about what should maybe British energy policy be. Because in many ways, a lot of it gets handed down from EU diktat or EU kind of policy decisions as to how you move into new forms of legislation and carbon emissions and what have you might like that. And so they were then saying, actually, a few people in that meeting started thinking, wouldn't that be quite good if we now stopped thinking that we were receivers of the grand will of the mandarins in Europe, and maybe we started to think about it ourselves, and maybe we could come up with something good. Now, maybe they could come up with something bad. I understand that.
It's a reboot. It's a reboot of our psychology. Robin, you've got something to say.
Just to come back to like the consequences for UK-EU relationship, I just I had on Audible David Cameron's book, this autobiography. But it was very interesting how his relationships with the different European leaders were played out in terms of international affairs. So, for example, what happened dealing with Putin? Then he and Merkel formed a seminar whereby Merkel gave presentations, and her team gave presentations about Putin because she understood it much better than the UK leaders did. And I think Cameron talks about the American situation where he had much more insight. So somehow they were able to work together, and he was able to use those relationships to have a lot of influence in different areas of the world. What do you think would happen in the going forward in the future if those relationships were more distant?
So, just to summarize a bit, it was if the relationships with...
I mean, what you're saying essentially is, will we have the sort of
will we have the same influence
before?
Yes.
And if we take it to the conversation that we've had, it'll be, in David Cameron's case, I think Buckinghamshire, the sovereign state of County of Buckinghamshire, negotiating with Yorkshire, negotiating with somebody else. So as England, or Britain outside the EU, will we have
the same power to be able to affect
this is a quick yes
common situations in the world?
The quick power of the UK negotiating with...
As a world...
Or dealing with
ranking power.
like Ebola, for example, or dealing with many situations.
If you're talking about trade deals, yes, under WTO rules, yes, it will have a power. But no, it will not have the same power, because we mentioned the concept of blocks, and whether we want to admit it or not, yes, the global economy right now and for the foreseeable future, and this is how it's moving, it's going to operate in economic blocks. So when you live in an economic block with a potential market of 500 million people, and now you negotiate as a market of 50 million people, isn't it?
60.
60 million. 60
It
million.
depends whether it's Yorkshire or England.
Yes.
So England's 50 million.
Yes.
Okay.
So no, you won't have the same power, but yes, you are welcome to negotiate. The terms will
Dictated by the laws.
will actually be seen in practice, and I fear that this will be a hard landing for the
I'm just
for
going
the
to ask,
economy.
as the one sort of leader, do you want to respond to that, Austin, or should we leave it?
Well, I mean, it's another hypothetical, so the answer is yes and no. I mean, yes, we ought to, but B, two things. One is with the negotiating skills that have been demonstrated in the last 3 years, possibly not. But I think that there is obviously a potential, because it's not just that we are one of a member of a 500 million person trade bloc. We are a significant player in this, wherever we are, the third, fourth largest economy in the world. So I think that there's an important role that Britain can still play, and we shouldn't downplay that. I mean, we still have the possibilities to go out there and make these deals.
I think I'd also like to make the point that Singapore, which has got about 6 million people max, is a massive power because it has massive intellect and certain trading regulations that everybody likes. So it's probably the most listened to voice in Southeast Asia.
Yes.
It's a one
in Southeast
And yet
Asia.
it joined ASEAN.
Yes.
And yet it joined ASEAN.
Yes.
I mean,
Yes.
the answer to your question is no, for the same reason that Pavlos has given. I mean, we are not going to be able to create new mechanisms. So you have to look at the existing mechanisms. Being excluded from those summits at the EU, and we're told we're not even going to be able to be observers at those as well, means that we will not be having that interpersonal relationship that you referred to, Robin, with other leaders and trying to conjure up deals and ideas. We will have to rely instead on the G7 and the G20, where we have only one voice in a much wider milieu, and that is not going to be as significant as our voice with all the economic clout that we have within the EU as it presently is.
I'd just like to tell a small anecdote, and then we're going to wrap up with some thoughts after that, is that to build on Austin's rupture anecdote, or thing, is that the weekend after the referendum, no, it's the second weekend after, because the weekend of the referendum, we met, and you told me more about Brexit than I'd ever known before. We were doing an Institute of Ideas thing. But there was a baker in the West Country, and he was very successful, and he sold his stuff into Tesco's and all that sort of thing. And he wasn't that big, about 50 people, and I'd known him for 30 years, and he said he had voted Brexit, and he was the first person that I'd met that had voted Brexit. And I said, why? I said, what has Europe stopped? He said, oh, nothing. And I said, well, why have you done it? He says, oh, there's going to be a problem because most of my workers come from Eastern Europe. I said, well, why on earth did you do it? And he said, I needed a kick up the butt because I was getting lazy. I need new ideas. I need to expand my business. And I talked to him 3 months ago. I bumped into him. I said, how is it? He said, it's going great. Because I woke up every morning working out how to deal with Brexit and make it better for my company. So I don't agree with him politically at all. But there is that psychological element in there that it could be dangerous, it could make us poorer. But there's half the country believes that. And just to sort of talk, but there's been a lot of stuff here about the lies that are being told and all the rest of it. Well, that is correct. There were lies told, and votes were probably based on those lies. But if those lies had been the predominant reason for the vote, then the polls would have been swinging in a much different direction than they are now. They haven't actually swung much. And that's why I'm saying that to sort of move on to the next point here, is this simmering of discontent that's going on all around the world, but we're looking at it in Europe. What consequences for the UK and EU relationship over Brexit, which is the simmering of discontent that we had here in Britain, but we've touched on that they've got it in Catalonia and in Hungary and in, all the rest of it.
I wouldn't put all of these.
I know you don't like to, but I'm afraid that they are in the same basket because people like me will put them in the same basket.
Of course, that's your job, but it's my job to
and
disagree
Japan
with
and
you.
South Korea and what's happening in Hong Kong and all, you know, if we look at the Hong Kong situation, that is a trading hub that is based on money.
Yeah.
And the people that are out there, a quarter of the population at one stage, were willing to risk that money in order to get whatever they thought they could get from that. So there is something going on. We can agree to disagree on it. But any more, not questions, comments, something like that, but let's address this topic and let's address it with something new. Don't just make a comment about what's been on all the chat shows, let's have new ideas. Gentleman there and then the lady there. We've got 10 minutes.
Yeah, I think something is missing in the whole debate, frankly. Because what has brought Europe together is shared culture and shared values that comes from the Judeo-Christian tradition. Now, there are also other people of other faiths, but you can find there are sort of universal values that we share. And there's common interests. So we understand the importance of human rights, the value of the individual, the innate value, the incomparable value of the individual. However, we are, as came out in the discussion, there's a greater validation and value found in my relationship with others. I'm validated even personally in my family. We're validated in community, we're validated in the European Union especially, based on fundamental values which are God-given.
Are these European values or are they these mechanisms of trade and visas and...
Well, what Europe shares is a Judeo-Christian tradition of values. It's God-given.
But that's a European value because Norway isn't in the European Union, nor is Switzerland, nor is Liechtenstein. So do they also share those values then, don't they?
Of course, but...
Well, yes, so then if Britain is outside of the European Union, technically, we are still part of the same value system.
Yes, so Brexit doesn't destroy that value system.
Sorry?
Brexit doesn't diminish the values.
Exactly, so the point is, our way forward, the question is, how do we move forward, is by recognizing fundamental shared values which are public, which go beyond myself. We don't fall into the trap of all this nationalism and all of this egotism where people try to separate themselves from others.
Okay. Is it lady... is it? No, yeah. Is it? Okay.
All right. One Polish gentleman told me recently that the Polish Minister of Commerce was very worried because England is the #1 customer for all their agricultural material, and that after that there could be a very serious problem that they may not be allowed to sell these materials, or maybe at a hefty cost, to England. I am a bit puzzled about that, and maybe you could comment?
Sorry, what were the materials? I didn't...
Agricultural material, all what the farms and people in rural area use.
Yeah. Any other points?
Thank you. I'm not entirely clear what the question is, but the whole debate today has been mainly about the politics, the trade and so on. And I just wanted to bring it down to actually people, because there are millions of individuals who are being very seriously affected in terms of their daily lives and their futures by this significant change. And I think it's not being talked about enough. So the fact that we have very elderly people in care homes who are being expected to complete settlement applications, the fact that the people who have invested their whole lives here, who are in some cases only being granted pre-settled status, that there are millions of, there are 2 million British people who are currently in really difficult circumstances living elsewhere within the European Union. And I don't think that within the debate there's been much care and consideration, I don't mean this debate in here, but I mean the broader debate, about what's happening and what's the consequences actually then for the wider and continuing relationships. Because many people feel very badly treated and are in fact going to suffer quite serious personal consequences.
Is there any scenario that you can see out of what you just said that makes Austin's point of there being a rupture that could create great things worth it?
For individuals?
For the people you just described, a very human situation. I know that, you know, there's always one individual that's going to lose out, but generally speaking, for that group of people that you said, is there anything that you could see?
Absolutely none. There needs to be an absolute guarantee of the rights of people who have, you know, made legitimate moves from one part of the continent to another and have invested their lives. And that has not been made. And I think, you know, I work for an organisation which is very involved in Windrush and sees how this government has treated people who come here quite legitimately and invested their lives here. And I have a huge concern, as do many others, about what are going to be the consequences for people in the years to come. And that hasn't been seriously addressed.
Let's take one more before we wrap. There's any more? No?
Can I just one here? Can I just say one thing?
Yes.
I have serious reservation about leaving Europe because, as a nation, I'm sure we will lose the respect of other nations. I think it's rather, you know, it strikes me as a rather devastating prospect that we would lose our sense of value in other nations. I mean, respect. Other nations, why would they want to deal with us? Just out of willing, just out of economic benefit? I don't think so.
The cricket?
That comes into focus now.
Okay, I'm going to ask the panel to wrap up before 4:30 and correctly answer, we've got the question here. What consequences for the UK and EU relationship? I've lost.
So, I think the consequences is what we will allow them to be. So, if we establish a constructive dialogue, even after all of this mess, there could be consequences for both parties in this debate. And it's on an individual level, and I completely agree with you. I find that very cruel. The fact that people that have established their livelihoods here, they have contributed towards the state, they're being treated with this, by this way. So I do think that the way that this, let's say that the way that the matter has been handled post-referendum is completely amateur in a number of ways. And I cannot believe how this can happen by government. So, with so many tools in their toolkit to actually make it work and to get the people unified, because I think one of the main consequences that may lead for a number of years is that sense of loneliness of the people among the different nations in the country, and how less unified that country will be post-Brexit. Even if it's a hard Brexit, a soft Brexit, and no Brexit at all, that won't change how people feel, because they've lived through that crisis, which has been social, cultural, economic, mindset crisis, and that's my final
sense of loneliness. I like that, Keith.
The fact that many people are affected by political change is not a reason for not undertaking political change, but it then becomes a matter of judgment and balance, and you have to weigh the benefits of the change against the demerits of the consequences to ordinary people such as you, Sally, pointed out. For me, I'm afraid it's not even the jury being out. I am, and I always have been, wholly convinced that that kind of disruption to people is not worthy of the sort of benefits that we might gain. The answer to the question is that it's going to be an ongoing relationship with the EU. for probably the best part of, well, most of all our lifetimes, looking around the room, including the young people in the room. For a start, we will see no real change in our relationship for the whole of the transition period, which will be at least until the end of next year. It may be extended beyond that. People who think that having a deal now is suddenly going to end the debate about Brexit are seriously misleading themselves, because we have now got to, this is the withdrawal bill, the withdrawal act, the deal. The whole raft of negotiating over medicine, supply of other things and everything like that, all that myriad of different relationships which we've developed in great complexity over the last 45 years of close integration with Europe, have all got to be worked out separately between ourselves and the European Union. That is going to take years, probably 2 decades. It took Canada 7 years to negotiate an agreement with the EU, and they were far less integrated in the EU than we were. So you can reckon it's going to take at least 7 years, and probably a lot longer. So there will be that continuing relationship. If, as Boris Johnson has said, he gets a free trade agreement with the EU, that is good from the point of view I said right at the outset of being viscerally in favour of free trade. But it does mean, under WTO rules, we will have to apply the same criteria on the most favoured nation basis to every other country. So you can expect to have lots of Brazilian wheat, you can expect to have lots of Argentinian beef, dare I say, chlorinated chicken and hormone-enhanced beef from the United States coming in, because we won't be able to stop it. And the impact on our way of life and our industries as we now know them will therefore change dramatically. And that is going to be the real consequence of this. Not the actual nature of the relationship with Europe, but the consequences domestically for how we're going to have to completely reorientate our lives.
Okay. Thank you. I'm going to put you down there as you're saying that you'll come back in 20 years and sum up what the consequences are.
And we'll still be talking about it.
And we'll still be talking about it. Austin?
I don't see anything wrong with chlorinated chicken. I mean, chlorine is in the water in America, like fluoride is in the water in this country. And there was a big scandal about fluoride, and I think we're overstating it. It's chlorine washed, it's not as if they injected it. Anyway, but I can't really answer that, especially to this level of skill and knowledge of the previous two, so I want to just answer the question about windrush and that kind of stuff, which I think is a fundamentally important question. I think I started by talking about the Fortress Europe phenomenon, where if you're in Turkey, I mean, the one country which will not be second, third or fourth division is Kurdistan. They're not going to get a look in. If you're in Libya, you're paid by the European Union to keep migrants in detention centres. So the repulsive kind of foreign policy interventionism of the European Union, the racist policy of the European Union, is very little spoken about, and I think that needs to be made clearer. The flip side of that, I agree with you, Windrush was a scandal, but in some ways that was a response to the hostile environment that was created because the Tories thought that if Brexit was a xenophobic vote, then they will play them at their own game and win the Brexit vote back in. So therefore, by creating a hostile environment, you can play the race card internally. Two things there. One is that Brexit was not a xenophobic campaign, even though we've heard a little bit about that on the platform already today. It was nothing to do, as far as I'm concerned, with race or with immigration as a big policy. And I think that the idea that we should treat people humanely, we should give students visas, we shouldn't be messing around how long can they stay in this country, tell them they can stay. If you're a foreign person from Europe or anywhere in the world, in my view, who has lived here for a reasonable amount of time, you can stay. I don't know what the problem is, right? I'm agreeing with you. And I think that we have to be a bit much more liberal in terms of our immigration policy, from my perspective. So I think that there's a kind of a politics playing going on with the establishment who really haven't got a handle on what the hell they're talking about. And I think that there's a much more vicious campaign done by the European Union, which nobody ever gets to talk about. Somehow we're talking about the Judeo-Christian views of the European Union, which I think even in Europe, but the European Union is a vicious organisation, yes, who pays Turkey to keep people in detention camps, yes, who has helped detain the Spanish, funded the Spanish to detain the Catalonian protesters. I mean, intern them. So I think we need to do a little bit more uncovering of really what the European Union really represents. It's not this kind of harmonious discussion about how they kept the peace all this time. As a matter of fact, it's a very fractious, very racist organisation with no democracy whatsoever at its core, and that's what I voted against.
Okay, that's thank you. So I've got a couple of things here from our great panel. Is that the consequences you did answer, although you said you couldn't, is that the next few years will uncover the nature of the European Union, and then we can judge more for ourselves whether it's a good or bad thing. Keith is going to come back 20 years from now and tell us what the consequences are. And this one from Pavlos I like the most is that when we leave we will have a sense of loneliness. Whether that's a good thing or a bad thing, I don't know. But I'd like you to give them all a great round.
Mention that there are teas and coffees downstairs if you'd like to enjoy them downstairs, and you are happy to stay here for a while. Martin's asking if you'd like a group photo.
First of all, let them have
the panel?
Can we thank Humphrey Hawksley for
Ah.
the parade?
Everybody. Right, everyone look at me. 1, 2, 3. Let me just check that.
Remain smiling.
Are you smiling?
Come.
Hang on,
You
hang
say
on.
1, 2, 3, Brexit!
Don't say that. Unsacred word.
Right, look at me. 1, 2, 3.
Brexit!
If your mouth remains, actually your mouth stays open more.
Can we thank the panel and thank Humphrey?
Somebody wants to Can you say where you are? But would you like to take a photo? Please come back. Come on.
Maybe from the stage, take
Can you
everybody.
When you ask for a group photo, if you want a group photo, you're welcome to come up.
You're not better.
You don't, it's okay. Don't worry.
Can we check out my photo? Come.
I think the photo should be taken this way. We've already had this photo.
No, but for you to name it.
Okay. What everyone's been. Everyone
Okay,
from the
right.
stage. Back to it.
Okay, come back, come back.
Right, ready?
Let's listen to reason here. Come.
Take this one first,
Come
now
here.
you're all there.
Why don't you come down and listen what Mike said? It's a good
Take this
idea.
one first.
Can you come?
I don't know. Yes.
Like this, come and sit in the middle, speakers.
Mark, can I take a photo?
Huh?
Can I just take this picture? Can I just take this picture of this?
Okay, sorry.
Simone?
I mean, this doesn't have any difference except 3 people.
Okay,
I
everybody.
want everybody. Yeah.
Okay, everybody looking at me. One more, I've got to go back. I've got to go back a bit more.
Enough now. We want the other picture, which is more important. Can you come down? Please? Speakers sit here. Come close. Speakers sit
This side.
All right, can you come forward? Come
quickly,
please.
guys.
Bring Austin specialist. No, I will not talk to you, ever. Yeah, because you were so sure. Oh, please don't worry about it. Robin, sit here. Humphrey, can you sit here? Mike. Can you come forward? Can you come forward?
Didn't work, but
Let's go. Can we fill up this side just here, please? Because we're all bunched in the middle at the back there. Come on that way. And I think I would prefer the people, everyone from the first row, to be standing up.
Okay, stand up.
Stand up, yes.
Okay, stand up. Stand up here. Stand
I
up.
will do this photo first. That was a carpet one. Hang on, let me try this again.
One day you get the big one.
Yeah, I will. What a good
So
idea.
that we can send it to them.